genuinely experiencing your emotions is such a big factor in resilience. You can't do that without having vulnerability with yourself, but also the major, really the most important factor in resilience is the relationships and social connection. And so what actually develops connection is that vulnerability, right? Because it's hard to genuinely connect with someone if you're not being open and transparent. And we often connect with other people around emotion, a shared experience of emotion.
That was Jenna Velez, my guest this week in the Recover Yourself podcast. Hello, I'm your host, Martin John, and we address topics you'll face on a journey to recovering yourself. This podcast is for all of you who have overcome addiction, disease, or disorders of any kind and are now on a path to help heal and inspire others to do the same. It's also here to expand the conversation of recovery to include that which we are recovering to, because everyone can benefit from the tenets of recovery. Today, we're addressing resilience, and my growth has everything to do with resilience. We're not advocating that people go through trauma or we put people through trauma so that they can grow through it, but we are saying that you grow through what you go through. I know that that was and continues to be true for me as it relates to my substance abuse and my life in general today. One thing I love is being shown where I can use more growth. It's uncomfortable, sure, but it is essential, and Jenna takes an opportunity to gently remind me of some judgments and assumptions that I am taking while talking with her. I would love if everyone can learn, one, how to bring it up, like when someone else is being judgmental, and two, how to take the suggestions when they do come up. I think we did a great job of interacting throughout this entire conversation, but I'll let you be the judge of that. Jenna, thank you so much for joining me. I am so glad to have you here.
I am really excited too. This is like one of those full circle moments.
Yeah, I
Um,
was on your podcast not long ago, and
yeah,
I've actually had a number of people reach out to me and say, "Wow, like what you shared was really great. I liked it," because I don't share a lot of my story, and I know I didn't even really share too much on yours, but it was such it was a good it was a good it was a good episode.
I love to hear that because yeah, we that's the whole point of it is that through storytelling and sharing our experiences, you create these connections and opportunities for people to just have that recognition of I'm not alone in what I'm experiencing. There's always someone else who can connect to that experience and understand. And also knowing that the storyteller themselves gets benefit from that also.
Yeah, yeah, it's good. It's good. I mean, yeah, I don't look back too often. Like it's always like again, my whole approach is what am I recovering to? So I'm always kind of looking
Yeah.
forward. And
That's right.
it's not that I dismiss the past. I just don't loiter there, right? Like
Hmm.
so it was nice to
Yeah.
spend some time and then actually listen to it over again and listen to myself and hear my voice say that and like be in that space.
I love that. That's cool.
So today we're talking about like growing through what you go through, right? Like grow
Yeah.
through what you go through. This is and we're talking about resilience, and right now in the world, like we are tapped, right? With
Yeah.
COVID and with all of the things, and I spoke with someone not long ago who talked about in a pandemic we are keeping people away from one another, and we need one another. We need to be
Hmm.
in community. Um, what are you seeing right now as some of the things like what are you seeing getting eroded right now that may need to have some attention put on it in terms of like the messaging behind resilience?
I love that question because I think a lot of what we saw from the very beginning of the pandemic, right, was warning, 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 like impending mental health crisis, all of this kind of stuff that was very scary. And while I think that's important messaging, right, because we know that this is going to have a profound impact on people's mental health, and we're seeing that already, particularly in like adolescents and young adults, the impact has been really, really profound. And I don't want to in any way minimize that. So I don't want anyone to, misconstrue what I'm saying here. But I do think that we have not seen enough of the messaging about the fact that in the face of adversity and trauma, the majority of people will experience resilience, and that some of them will even experience growth. And I think if we don't get that message out there enough, then people will expect that as they are going through this adversity or experiencing distress and things like that, that is not okay, and that it's going to lead to negative outcomes. And that's not actually the case. It can and it will for some. And for many, it will feel that distress will be very present for a period of time, but it doesn't mean that that's going to be the outcome, and that you're not going to be able to move through that distress and come out the other side and experience that resilience of returning to whatever it was, like the level of functioning that you had before, or potentially even finding new meaning in life and experiencing what we would refer to as post-traumatic growth.
Mm-hmm. Oh wow, post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
So that's beautiful, and I know. So our world has our society, let's say, I mean, I don't know every place. I know in the United States we have really embraced the soundbite and the little like quips and the little like memes and things like that. So
Yeah,
like
that's
it's
true.
okay to not be okay, like
Mm-hmm.
things like that. And this is a great message. But I have a
Yes.
quote. I have a quote that I put out on my social media, which was like, "It is okay to not be okay, but it's not okay to not do anything about it."
Mm. Okay.
Right?
Yeah, no,
So
I think
so
that makes
so
sense. Yeah.
yeah, and I would love to get your kind of take on this sort of happiness train that we all really like to get on, like in the especially as it relates to just consumerism and and how we have like geared people to just say like if it's not good for me, I'm going to get rid of it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I mean, I think it makes me think of this term toxic positivity, right? Where it's just this idea that, like you said, the happiness train of, okay, let's just focus on the positive. And, it's almost like you feel like it's looked down upon to actually have a negative emotion. Like you said, it's okay to not be okay, but it's not okay not to do anything about it. I think what's important to say there is like post traumatic growth, resilience, those things don't happen without the experience of distress. That distress is necessary for that process. So, yeah, it is okay. And because I think when we try to like block ourselves from actually allowing ourselves to feel those feelings, whether they be anxiety or sadness or anger or whatever it is in that moment, rather than saying, let me embrace this. This is what I'm truly, genuinely feeling right now. And that it's okay for me to feel this, and that it's actually going to help me move towards growth because I can recognize this, I can embrace it, I can accept it and acknowledge it. And then I can also accept and acknowledge that there's other things, that there's other emotions coexisting as well, that I still experience joy when I look outside and see the sunshine, or, when I have a really great connection or conversation with someone, that brings me joy. And that doesn't take away from the negative feeling. It coexists with it and it moves you towards that resilience and growth. But when you try to block yourself and not allow yourself to feel those emotions, whatever they are, good, bad, in between, whatever labels we place on them, then they come out in other ways. So you can't stop yourself from actually experiencing those things. They exist, they're human.
One of the things that's popping up in my mind right now is this idea that like it's two sides of the same coin, right? If you want to be happy, if you want to be, I mean, happy is such a silly word in my mind right now. It's like happy. What does that even mean? But if you want this like highs of what happiness is, like it only exists in comparison to another thing, right? Like if you've
Mm-hmm.
never been sad, what do you know about happiness? Sort of.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Oh,
yeah.
definitely. Yeah. And I think like that term, like you said, of happiness and all that, I mean, can mean different things to different people. But to me, it feels like something that's so tied to the experience of what's going on versus something like meaning. So there's an author, her name is Emily Esfahani Smith, and she wrote this book called The Power of Meaning. And I think that really helps to, because her whole research was based on the fact that, like, as a society, we're always seeking happiness, but really that doesn't bring us what we're looking for. Like, it's so fleeting. But the concept of meaning, developing meaning in your life is actually so much more powerful.
Oh wow, that's really beautiful. I'll definitely check that out. So I often like talk to individuals, and I want to hear your response to this, just because I mean I have you here, like as a captive. We don't know what is best for us. This is something that I've learned along the way, right? Like I don't know the thing that is going to bring me the thing that I want, right? Like, and if we ask ourselves, what do you want? And then go out and try and get it, we often fall short.
Mm.
And, and, and yeah, I would love just to see how, where you're on that. This might get cut. I don't know, but like, I'm
Yeah.
intrigued by how, like that relationship and then this.
Yeah. I don't know. That's an interesting question. I think you're right. I mean, we don't often know what the result of something that we do is going to be, right? Like, we may think, oh, this thing is going to bring me peace, or this thing is going to bring me, joy, or whatever it is. And then you try it and realize, okay, that didn't work. It's kind of like that experimentation, right? It's all trial and error. And then when you discover something that works really well, you're going to want to continue doing that. And maybe it works for the long term, or maybe it's something that eventually down the road, as look at it, you're like, okay, this isn't really bringing me what it used to, and I'm going to now experiment and try to find something else. And yeah, so I think there is a lot of that trial and error and experimentation that happens in figuring out what it is that we need at any given time and what feels right.
And I want to draw that line back to happiness, right? We don't know what's going to bring us happiness, right? We don't know, like we could guess as to, oh, it's going to make me happy when I
Mhm.
do X, or when I have X, or when something happens. But happiness just exists, right? It's like it could just be here right now. And so I do feel like having a conversation is a good way of kind of putting it, where it's like, how are we approaching happiness? Is it something that is achievable, or is it something that we are in conversation with?
Right. And I mean, so much of it is about the narrative we create around what we're feeling and experiencing, right? Because emotion is just emotion, right? And it draws from what we're thinking and what we're saying about what we're experiencing. So the narrative becomes the most important thing. It's not about the experience itself, but more about what we're telling ourselves about that experience.
When we look out at this world of just be happy, and
Uh-huh.
we don't know what makes us happy, it's so easy to
Mm.
pick up, okay, I want money, I want a big house, I want a big car, I want to do these things, right? Like
Right.
that are just being shuffled, like just shoved in our face, is like, this is going to make you happy. Um, it is, it's hard to say, no, I actually don't care about any of those things, right?
Hmm.
So let's go back and like, 'cause although we did talk about vulnerability in a, we didn't actually use the word, I think, but we did talk about like being
Right.
present in that. So can we let's address vulnerability directly as it relates to us. Like, why do we need to be vulnerable in order to, or do we need to be vulnerable in order to find resilience?
Well, I think it's definitely a key element, right? Because if we already talked about the fact that genuinely experiencing your emotions is such a big factor in resilience, you can't do that without having vulnerability with yourself. But also really the most important factor in resilience is the relationships and social connection. And so what actually develops connection is that vulnerability, right? Because it's hard to genuinely connect with someone if you're not being open and transparent. And we often connect with other people around emotion, a shared experience of emotion. So I think vulnerability is a huge factor there. And I mean,
So
just your example before about like seeking the things, right? Like the house, the money, all that. We have plenty of examples in our society that demonstrate that that is not what gets you there. So
right.
I think, it's for sure a fallacy, and we can find plenty of examples to support that.
And I'm a firm believer of
Yeah.
vulnerability being like being at the core of all this. Vulnerability is not something that's quantifiable, right? Like,
True.
and that's something that often gets overlooked in
Mhm.
so many areas, especially when we get out of once we step out of the centers that we work in and then the places that we talk, like it can get really lost in the shuffle.
Right.
And but vulnerability means going through something difficult.
Yeah, exactly. And I think because otherwise, what are you doing? If you're not being vulnerable, then you're putting up a shell, you're putting up a wall, and it's, that you're putting up something that blocks that experience. And so, if you picture that, like, okay, so then you can't move through that thing if you have that wall up. And it doesn't mean you have to be an open book with every single person that you encounter, but it means in the right context with the right people and the right relationships, that experience of vulnerability is going to be the thing that propels you forward. It's going to be hard. It's not going to feel great probably. But once you experience that genuine connection, you recognize like the power of it.
And that's something that like that's at the core of what we're talking about today, right? Like this idea of like, oh man, like what is your perception of the world, and is it a place that you can be vulnerable? And it might not be the entire world, right? It might just be
Yeah.
in a meeting, it might just be in groups of certain people, and you may be able to be vulnerable with different groups of people in different ways.
Mhm.
What are some of the like core things that you have found, like in terms of like successes that you have found, successes that you have spoken to? And success is something that's fleeting. I understand that success is something that rent is due every day, right? Like you have to figure that out like day to day.
Yeah.
What are some practices, or what are some things that you have found that distinguish vulnerability that is growth oriented versus like that facade of vulnerability that actually closes people off, and like from a place of fear or whatever they're like are there things that we can see that are like, oh whoa, like we want to keep an eye on that, or this is something that I can embrace as true vulnerability?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a hard question because yeah, like you said, success, like what really is success? And sometimes our efforts, even if they don't turn out the way that we hoped that they were, they're still a part of that journey. And so it's kind of hard to discount that. But I
Mm-hmm.
think the positive, focusing on those positive social relationships. So giving a lot of energy into a relationship that is not healthy is probably not a factor that's going to promote resilience, right? It's those positive social relationships. Um, I mean, look, this sounds really simplistic, but
And it's
healthy
not at all, yeah.
healthy routines, healthy behaviors are some of the factors that promote resilience, right? So looking at what are the things that I do in my daily life that I know are good for me based on how I feel and, what they bring into my life. So, yeah, pretty simple things, right? Like having a healthy diet, paying attention to nutrition and what you feel like when you eat certain things, exercise. I mean, for me, that has been a key. And I know that I just feel better when I get a good workout in, and if I don't, I notice a difference. Like I don't feel as patient maybe, or I don't know, just I notice a difference in the way that I feel. So taking care of yourself, like I said before, allowing yourself to really feel your feelings and not try to push through those negative ones because you think that you're not supposed to feel them.
Mhm.
genuinely feeling them, allowing yourself the time you need to do that. But all of them, but also like in a situation where it seems like, oh, I shouldn't, I don't know, sometimes like after the loss of a loved one or something, people are like, oh, they feel guilty if they have a positive feeling. So it's the
Right.
same thing. It's like, no, that grief and that joy and can really coexist. And then the last thing I would say that is a really good practice for developing resilience and promoting resilience is gratitude. And so, people do this in different ways, right? Sometimes people like to journal or do like a gratitude meditation or mindfulness activity or something like that. But spending time every day focusing on at least one thing that you are grateful for, it really makes a difference and can is a factor in promoting that resilience.
And I asked this question, and I understand how kind of I don't want that question to come off as if like I am dismissing people like who are trying to find their message. And it's a but there is toxic positivity in
Right.
that healing journey. And so often, I mean, I have found recently, like I get a little sour taste in my mouth when people embrace, like I am all about like body positivity, but
Mm-hmm.
there is a line where, you know, when you're still when you are recovering from having a bad experience with like body positivity. So like you believe that a certain body type is right, you don't have that body type, and then
Mm.
you fight the system that gave you that idea, right? Like plus size princess and things like that. Like those sorts of ideas can be just attacking the thing that and like that self-awareness is at the core of vulnerability rather than anger or not that anger is not a path to that. Probably will get cut this, but I just wanted to kind of bring up that and see if you had anything to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, just like there are factors that promote resilience, I feel like, there are things that hinder resilience. So, avoidance of feelings is one of them, right? Avoidance of whatever that feeling is that you're avoiding. If it's something that you're feeling and you're avoiding that, then yeah, that's a factor that's because, like you said, that concept of toxic positivity and its relationship to healing, well, it's a hindrance to healing, actually. So just focusing on the positive, it may feel like, okay, that's what I need to do to get through this. But if you do that at the expense of actually feeling the sadness or grief or whatever it is that is genuinely there, then it's actually not promoting your healing. It's a hindrance to your healing.
Yeah. And this brings up the like because I do believe that there are times where it's okay to wallow, um, but but
Yeah.
but there's also a time to stop wallowing. Like and like it can get so comfortable for some to be in that state, and I don't think I'm in a position, and I don't know that anybody's in a position to tell somebody else what to do and how to process that. And like the title of this episode is "You Are All That You Go Through." And
Mm-hmm.
so even if you're going through something in a way that um, even if you're going through something that is driven through anger, you grow from that because you will
Mm-hmm.
gain from all of those things. So there's no wrong way of going about it. And as like, I mean, I don't want my questions to be like, hey, this is wrong, because there's definitely no wrong way of going about it.
It looks different for everybody. Yeah. And the timeline is not fixed either. And it's never over. Like, I also think we talk a lot about coexisting emotions, right? But like we know that maybe about 7 to 8% of the population after a trauma will experience post-traumatic stress disorder, right? We hear a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder, not so much about post-traumatic growth, but also those things also, if you develop post-traumatic stress disorder, it's not the opposite of post-traumatic growth because that can still come. and there's no timeline on it. So that growth may take years and years because as we develop a narrative and make meaning from our experiences, that can happen over and over and over again. Every time we talk about it, we could learn something new or create a new narrative or rework that narrative in a way that propels us forward or branches off into a different direction. And I think that's such a hopeful message because it's never over. There's always a new opportunity to look at something into, and change is never a linear process. We know that, right? You know that from all the experience you have and talking with people, going through recovery. I mean, maybe for some people it's a linear process, but I haven't met anyone yet.
That's right. That's right. I like to say, like, I don't care how much you have done, the amount you have to do never changes.
That is so true.
Right?
Yeah.
So and the thing is we are all that we go through. And whether we went through like serious trauma as a child or we had, a fairly easy childhood or whatever, like we're all going through this and we are here trying to understand it as a whole. I think trying to
Mhm.
say like, oh, I can explain this. I think that gets us into a pretty deep pit of trying to make it one way, make it linear, make it logical. Because I don't think life can follow just a logical path.
Mm. Yeah, right. Because again, and that's why it's so important to recognize that it's not so much about what happens, but about the meaning that's made from it, right? Because otherwise we'd just be pulled in different directions multiple times a day based on the experiences we have, what we go through, which oftentimes we don't have control over, right? There are some things we do, but there's a lot in life that we can't control and things that happen to us that we could not have prevented or stopped no matter what we did, right? Like that's just the way life is. So if we make it about the experiences, then just you kind of have to just forget it, right? Because like then you are what has happened to you versus this idea of you are all that you go through. I think of that more so like you're not labeled, you are not these experiences, but these experiences have shaped you and will continue to shape you, and you can continue to create new meaning from them as new experiences get added on as well. It's all a part of your life.
Can you address some cultural myths about strength and vulnerability and like even like post-traumatic growth and ideas that we have that are around us that we have adopted that just
Mm-hmm.
that's not true.
Yeah. Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think with post-traumatic growth, and we did kind of talk about this, but just to kind of like reinforce it, is the idea that when you see these examples of people who have been through something and then, something great comes out of it, that we can never just look at those as you have to know what happened in the in between, right? Because they didn't get there without experiencing a lot of distress. So the role of distress in all of this, I think, is really important, right? Like that you cannot get there without experiencing the distress. It's a necessary element. So I think there certainly have been times, right, where the idea about mental health, right, if you were diagnosed with a mental health condition, that okay, well, basically that's it. You're not going, like your life is over. Your whatever you had in mind for yourself is not going to have, particularly a serious mental illness, right? But we know that recovery is actually not, and we always like to say, like, recovery is possible for all. And to be honest, with the right supports in place and all of that, probable, not just possible, but probable. And that's a very different message than we had even, I would say, even like 15 years ago,
Right.
that the idea was, okay, there are certain conditions that just, no, yeah, change your goals for your life. They're not going to happen.
Right.
And that's not true. And then the other thing that I think, culturally speaking, is there's this real emphasis on the concept of grit. And I think that sometimes that is can be a dangerous message, right? Because it's like the idea that you just, I don't want to say that people should give up, so that's what I'm saying. Like, think about everything that we've talked about already today and the factors in promoting resilience and what you do. None of that was about just pushing through and like, you do it on your own and you just like this idea of independence and, you do it yourself and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Resilience is about feeling everything, experiencing everything, and also the social support aspect of it, right? Which for me, I don't know, maybe that is a part of grit. Maybe I misunderstand grit. But when I hear that, it makes me think of like, oh, you're like this soldier that just pushes through any adversity and you never look back, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's not how it happens for most people. Maybe for some people they can get there, but you know what? They're probably going to experience some stuff down the road because they allow themselves to actually feel their feelings.
Yeah.
But I think it's a much healthier message to say slow down, feel what you're feeling, know that it's all part of the process, and that it is part of growing and being resilient and accept the support around you because that is the number one factor in promoting resilience.
The work that we do is really, like it just keeps coming up in everybody that I talk to. It's like when we say the message of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you have to do it on your own.
Mm-hmm.
That is one message that has a lot of force to it, right? And so that's in the Zen sort of world, it's a lot of yang energy, a lot of masculine energy, right? But when you and I talk about the idea of like you are going through things as a unique individual,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to get through that, however you're going to get through that. It's the same message from another sort of like with a different meaning, right? It is like it moves into this yin sort of more feminine sort of openness. Just like that's how I'm expressing it, and I want to kind of move to you and see like, well, what are your thoughts?
I don't know a whole lot about the whole Zen approach, the yin yang. I'm not like well schooled in that. So,
Yeah,
but no, I get what you're saying, right? There is still this personal responsibility in the sense that like it's still your life, right? But how are you moving through that adversity? Are you pushing through and just like trying to get to the other side? Or are you taking the experience as it comes, allowing yourself to feel everything within that, searching for meaning within it, and then using that to move you through it. It's a much more conscious and thoughtful process. It's still you, right? But like you're getting support from the people in your life. Maybe it's through talking to them and talking and being open and vulnerable allows you to create that narrative or at least start that narrative. Um, so I think it is different. I think, right, if you think about sort of what was idealized in the past, what we were talking about before, this concept of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, all of that. I mean, that's still present, right? But I think we're slowly moving away from that concept and recognizing what actually really makes a long lasting difference. It's not just about getting through that experience because we know when you don't do it in a healthy way, it's going to come out in unhealthy ways in the future down the road. And that's going to create a whole other set of issues that we then have to deal with. So
absolutely.
I think societally, yeah. And if in terms of the COVID pandemic and, if you think about it, I think we've come probably 10 years in the 18 months or however longer than that now that it's been in terms of understanding mental health because people who never maybe thought like, oh, you can just like get over it,
Yeah.
just think differently about this or that, who maybe experienced that for the first time themselves personally or watched somebody else that they were close with, maybe developed a new understanding about what that really is
Mm-hmm.
and maybe developed more compassion and understanding as a result of that. So I hope that sticks.
And I think it will. Like one of the things I wanted to say was that just like we don't want to tell people that their path is wrong, we also don't want to say like the ideas that they had in the 50s were wrong. Like they've
Mhm.
changed, and we've changed tactics, and it's no longer the right tactic.
Mhm.
Maybe it was never the right tactic, but seeing as we're not in the 50s right now, we can't really speak to that.
Yeah, it's
Um,
not really important to, figure out if it was right or wrong back then. It's just a
right,
matter of what are we learning and how are we growing as a society today? And what
right,
does it mean now? What do we know now?
right. And what can we say? This is the way forward now.
Hmm.
Rather than like this was never right and we want to, like, who cares? Like we know this now and we can change now. And and
Hmm.
and that's something we can all bring into our life to increase resilience to that which happens, because a lack of resilience, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is a lack of ability to see change or to see that change is possible.
Yeah, I mean, right. If you don't experience resilience, like we talked about some of the factors that hinder that, right? And so, look, for some people with a history of really compounding trauma and things like that, this process is harder, right? And that's going to be a factor that makes it much harder to experience that. We also know that there are people who really lack social support in their life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we know that there are these factors that hinder, but what happens is, yeah, there's this like you might get stuck. And I mean, the good thing is that it's never, like we said before, it's never over, right? That's not the end all be all. Where you are right now is maybe stuck, but that doesn't mean you can't ever get unstuck. And so it's just a matter of when is that going to happen and how is that going to happen? And but it's never over
I'm really glad
until
that
it's
you always
over.
bring. I'm glad that you always bring me back, because so much of what I talk about is, like beyond the ledge, right? Like you've already backed off the ledge. Like that is where I kind of approach. And because you work with the population more than I do, it's really important to understand that where you are is cool. Like whatever it is you're doing, like, and where you're at, like there's I don't ever want to come off as being judgmental about where someone is or how they're approaching it. Um,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And it's a tricky balance. One of the things I think is really helpful for all of us in terms of being able to catch ourselves and to do that is when we see something that our first reaction is like that sort of judgment or that thought process, to take a step back and ask, rather than asking the question, and I'm not saying you would say it like this, but what's wrong with this person or what's wrong with you, to say what
right,
happened to you or what's happening to you in this moment that is leading me to see what I'm seeing right now that I
yeah,
don't understand,
yeah,
and so I think that is such a helpful shift in questioning for all of us to, have more understanding and compassion for there is so much when we see something and the outward signs, whether it's someone reacting really angrily or even violently or things like that, to that there is so much below the surface that we have no idea about. And it doesn't, I'm not saying like we justify everything based on but like it helps us to develop an understanding and a way to approach that in a different way that's more likely to have an impact and be
right,
helpful.
yeah. And that will also yield more self care, because that
Mm.
judgment that we're putting out there is definitely coming from some judgment that's happening within us.
Yeah, that's a great point too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
it
so
usually stems from something yeah,
that'll give us
that
more,
lack of understanding.
and that'll give us more access to resilience.
Yeah, and more empathy. And that's something I think we need a lot more of. Like, we can never
Yeah.
have too much.
Right. Just care and understanding. Like that's like
Yeah.
at the end of the day, if we can be if we can be understanding of another person, that is going to that is that is going to give us more energy and more space and more time to be caring to the next person.
Yeah.
And that's what we need. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about what is resiliency. Resiliency at its core is the ability to step back up and offer care again.
Right, exactly. Like that whole bounce back kind of thing. Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and as long as we understand that it's not just like a boop boop bounce, it's like there's a lot in between there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of the things, like that's why this podcast is not about telling stories, because I want the transition into that which we are moving towards, and I'm really super grateful for you to have joined me.
Yeah, this was a great conversation. I think we covered a lot of ground and hopefully there's little, nuggets in there that stick out for whoever's listening, that maybe one little thing that kind of sticks. And yeah, I think it was great. I think we covered a lot.
I'm really, like, I just want to readdress that, like, really grateful that, like, when I'm just grateful that you slowed me down a bit, and that was really nice. I was just like, yeah, like, even in sometimes I'm just like, well, I didn't mean it that way. I'm like, shut up, that's what you said. Like, and it's really important for me to recognize that. And that's, like, not that I'm making judgments, but there is
Hmm.
judgment in there, right? Like, and there is, well, maybe not
Well,
judgment,
we
but
all have that.
yeah, right.
We
Like,
all, yeah.
and it gives me an opportunity to just kind of, like when we're done here, like, I can sit down and I can be like, huh. And
Mhm.
I'm editing it, I can be like, all right, well, what can I own here, and where can I continue growing and building my own resilience.
Yeah, we all need to do that for sure. I mean, it happens all the time if we're not always, continuing to examine our thoughts and all of that. I think it's helpful. And the great thing about doing that on a podcast is that just everything we talked about, right? That's vulnerability. That's you doing that in front of an audience because you know that someone else or many other people probably are having the same thought process, right? So now you've provided this opportunity for someone to hear their own thoughts out loud and then maybe have that opportunity to self-examine also. So it has a ripple effect and it's vulnerability and I love it.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. I love, like, being vulnerable can scare people away, but I'm really glad
Mhm.
that I'm able to be vulnerable with you, and vice
Yeah,
versa, and that just helps us see each other and have deeper conversations that are
for
meaningful.
sure. Exactly. Couldn't agree more.
Oh, Jenna, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Recovery is possible for everyone. No matter what you have been through or born with, your life can be better than it is right now because you are resilient. It's a trait. You carry it. For some of you, the forceful approach of picking yourself up by your bootstraps might work, but if it hasn't, then maybe it's time to look at it from another angle. Maybe you need to practice being more yielding, allowing yourself to be vulnerable, asking for help, and practicing receiving. I once heard that receiving should be an Olympic sport, and I would agree. You're unique, but you're not alone. You're not the only one dealing with what you're dealing with, and I hope you find the resilience you're looking for in your life. I want to thank Jenna and the Mental Health Association of Westchester for participating in the Recover Yourself podcast. You can find links to more information about them in the description of this episode. Please rate and review this podcast and or leave comments for this episode to help me better create helpful content for you. Support this show at anchor.fm or support me and my work at Patreon, where you will get access to unedited content as well as writings and access to supporter group portrait sessions with me. I host workshops regularly, which are open to the public but also a source of continuing education units for professionals. I also take a limited number of one-on-one clients every month, so contact me through martinjohn.com when you're ready to work together. I accept financial support through Venmo at martinjohn_Garcia. So if you benefit from listening to this content, please consider supporting my efforts. Thank you for listening to the Recover Yourself podcast, and until next time, keep recovering yourself.